The late afternoon sun cast golden rays through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Caldwell Tower, illuminating the sleek chrome and glass of the executive suite. Julian Caldwell stood at his desk on the 40th floor, overlooking the sprawling cityscape of Chicago. At 41 years old, he had transformed his father's modest construction company into a billion-dollar empire spanning commercial development, green energy investments, and sustainable architecture. The Caldwell name adorned office buildings from Seattle to Miami, each one a testament to innovation and environmental responsibility. Yet for all his professional triumphs, nothing brought him more peace than thinking about the two women who anchored his life, his mother Rosemary and his fiancée Sienna Hartley. Rosemary Caldwell had been widowed when Julian was 15, losing her husband to a sudden heart attack that left her reeling. She had been a high school English teacher, beloved by her students. But after her husband's death, she took on extra tutoring jobs and summer school classes to ensure Julian could attend the engineering program at Northwestern. She never remarried, never complained about the long hours or the sacrifices. Now at 74, she lived in the garden cottage on Julian's estate in Lake Forest, a charming stone structure surrounded by the flower beds she tended with loving care. Her auburn hair had turned to soft silver, always styled in a neat bob, and her hazel eyes held a gentleness that came from decades of nurturing others. She spent her days reading poetry, volunteering at the local library, and occasionally joining Julian for dinner in the main house. Sienna Hartley had swept into Julian's world 3 years ago at an art gallery opening in River North. She was breathtaking, 34 years old, with platinum blonde hair that fell in perfect waves, striking blue-green eyes that seemed to change with her mood, and a presence that commanded attention in any room. She worked as a luxury brand consultant, though Julian had noticed she seemed to spend more time attending events than actually working. Sienna had a way of making him feel alive again after years of burying himself in work following a painful divorce a decade earlier. 8 months ago, he had proposed to her at sunset on his sailboat on Lake Michigan, and she had accepted with tears of joy. The wedding was planned for June, an elegant affair at the estate with 250 guests, a renowned chef, and fireworks over the private lake. Everything appeared flawless. Julian had rebuilt his life after his divorce, found professional success beyond his wildest dreams, discovered love again with a captivating woman, and his mother lived comfortably nearby. He took pride in how well everything had come together. If only he had been more observant, he might have noticed the darkness creeping into the corners of his seemingly perfect world. Rosemary sat in the cottage's small conservatory, her hands shaking slightly as she arranged wildflowers in a ceramic vase she had made herself years ago. The bruise on her upper arm had faded to a sickly yellow-green, barely visible beneath her long-sleeved blouse. She kept glancing toward the window, watching for any sign of Sienna's white Range Rover. Sienna had left for a spa appointment 2 hours ago, but Rosemary never knew when she might return early. The anxiety had become her constant companion, a tight band around her chest that never fully released. It had started gradually, maybe 6 months after the engagement. At first it was just subtle digs, comments about how Rosemary's cottage needed updating, how her clothes were so quaint, how it must be challenging to keep up with modern conversations at her age. Rosemary had brushed it off initially, attributing it to pre-wedding stress or generational differences, but the verbal jabs had evolved into something far more sinister. The first physical incident had happened in the main house kitchen. Rosemary had been preparing her famous apple pie for Julian's birthday when she accidentally knocked over one of Sienna's expensive juice cleanse bottles. The green liquid had splattered across the marble counter, and before Rosemary could even apologize, Sienna's perfectly manicured nails had dug into her shoulder, shoving her roughly against the cabinet. Sienna's voice had dropped to a menacing whisper, warning Rosemary that if she ever embarrassed her in front of Julian's business associates again, there would be serious consequences. Rosemary had been too shocked to respond, too frightened to tell her son what had just occurred. Since that day, the incidents had multiplied. A sharp pinch here, a cruel twist of the wrist there. Always when Julian was traveling for business or locked in his home office during important calls, Sienna had mastered the art of the performance. When Julian was present, she was the attentive future daughter-in-law, constantly asking about Rosemary's comfort, suggesting they all have lunch together, even offering to help with wedding invitation addressing. But the moment Julian's attention shifted elsewhere, Sienna's mask would slip, revealing cold calculation underneath. Rosemary had tried to convince herself she was being overly sensitive, that perhaps she was misinterpreting things in her older age, but she knew the truth. Sienna didn't love Julian. She loved his wealth, his status, his connections to Chicago's elite. Rosemary was simply an inconvenience, a reminder of Julian's middle-class roots that didn't fit the narrative Sienna wanted to present. And Rosemary, who had spent her entire life protecting her son, couldn't bear the thought of destroying his happiness by exposing the woman he planned to marry. So she remained silent, absorbing the cruelty in private, inventing explanations for the occasional bruise. Julian noticed. She told him she had bumped into furniture or caught her arm on the cottage door. He believed her because he had no reason not to. The guilt consumed Rosemary constantly, but her fear of breaking Julian's heart was stronger than her desire to save herself from the abuse. Julian returned to the estate that evening energized. He had just secured a landmark deal to develop Chicago's first carbon-neutral office complex, a project that would cement his reputation as a leader in sustainable development. He found Sienna in the great room, artfully arranged on the leather sectional with a glass of champagne, looking like she belonged in an architectural magazine. She smiled radiantly when he entered, rising to greet him with a kiss that promised celebration later. They discussed wedding details over dinner. Sienna wanted to add a champagne fountain and upgrade the floral arrangements again, increasing the budget by another $30,000. Julian agreed absently, his mind already on the construction timeline for the new project. He asked about his mother, and Sienna assured him that Rosemary had enjoyed a quiet day in her garden and had declined dinner saying she was tired. Julian made a mental note to check on her in the morning, but thought nothing more of it. What Julian didn't see was the confrontation that had occurred just 90 minutes before his arrival. Rosemary had been in the main house, returning a book she had borrowed from Julian's library, when she accidentally walked past Sienna's dressing room and glimpsed several shopping bags from luxury boutiques, easily $10,000 worth of purchases. When Rosemary had innocently mentioned that the bags must be for the honeymoon, Sienna had exploded. She had grabbed Rosemary by both arms and shaken her violently, hissing that what she did with Julian's money was none of the old woman's business, and that Rosemary should stay in her cottage where she belonged. When Rosemary had tried to pull away, Sienna had shoved her hard against the doorframe, leaving her breathless and terrified. Rosemary had fled back to her cottage, her body trembling, her heart racing. She had locked the door and drawn the curtains, declining dinner with a text message claiming exhaustion. From her window she had watched Julian's Tesla pull into the circular drive, and her heart had ached. Her son looked so happy, so unaware that the woman he loved was capable of such cruelty. Weeks passed, and Julian remained oblivious. He was consumed with the new development project, spending long hours in meetings with city planners, environmental consultants, and investors. Sienna encouraged these commitments, insisting she could handle the wedding preparations and keep Rosemary company. Julian trusted her completely, grateful to have found someone who seemed so invested in family. He would call each evening from whatever meeting he was in, and Sienna would paint pictures of pleasant afternoons with Rosemary, how they had looked at old photo albums together or discussed flower arrangements. The reality couldn't have been more different. With Julian preoccupied, Sienna's treatment of Rosemary intensified. She criticized everything: Rosemary's soft-spoken manner, her simple wardrobe, her preference for staying in the cottage rather than joining them for every meal. She made it clear that after the wedding, she would convince Julian to move Rosemary to a retirement community. Sienna wanted the estate to herself, wanted to host sophisticated gatherings without the awkward presence of Julian's aging mother in her shabby cottage. Rosemary's spirit began to fracture under the relentless assault. She started spending even more time alone, avoiding the main house entirely, losing weight as her appetite disappeared along with her will to resist. The light in her hazel eyes dimmed, replaced by constant weariness. When Julian was home, she forced smiles and pretended everything was fine, but the effort exhausted her completely. One particularly vicious afternoon, Sienna had found Rosemary looking through Julian's childhood artwork that Rosemary had saved. Crayon drawings, elementary school projects, report cards with glowing comments from teachers. Sienna had snatched them away, mocking Rosemary for living in the past with junk. She had told Rosemary that Julian's real life began when he became successful, that everything before, including Rosemary's sacrifices, was just a sad prologue to his actual achievements. She had thrown the artwork in the trash, forcing Rosemary to watch. Those words had cut deeper than any physical pain. Rosemary had given everything for her son, had worked herself to exhaustion to provide opportunities, had sacrificed her own dreams and potential relationships to ensure he could thrive, and now this woman, who had contributed nothing, who loved only Julian's money, was dismissing it all as worthless. Yet still, Rosemary said nothing. Her love for Julian was absolute, and she convinced herself that his happiness mattered more than her suffering. She told herself that maybe after the wedding, once Sienna felt secure as Mrs. Caldwell, the cruelty might stop. It was a desperate hope, one she clung to even as all evidence suggested otherwise. But sometimes fate has other plans, and secrets have a way of forcing themselves into the light when least expected. The truth was about to reveal itself in the most devastating way imaginable. Julian had scheduled a business trip to New York, 2 days of crucial meetings with investors for the carbon-neutral project. He had kissed Sienna goodbye that morning, reminded her to check on his mother, and headed to O'Hare. His private jet had taken off on schedule, and Sienna had watched from the window with satisfaction, already planning how she would use these 2 days to further break Rosemary's spirit and establish her dominance. What Sienna didn't know was that the lead investor had suffered a medical emergency that morning, forcing the cancellation of all meetings. Julian received the notification just as his plane touched down in New York. After a quick call to confirm the investor was stable but unable to proceed, Julian's pilot filed a return flight plan. By early afternoon, Julian was back in Chicago, driving toward Lake Forest hours earlier than anyone expected. He decided to surprise Sienna, maybe take her to that new restaurant in the city she had been wanting to try. He thought about calling ahead but decided against it, looking forward to seeing her face when he walked through the door. As his car approached the estate, he noticed how still everything seemed. Sienna's Range Rover was parked in its usual spot, so he knew she was home. He smiled, imagining her surprise. Julian entered through the main entrance, calling out a greeting. No response. The house felt strangely quiet, almost oppressive. He set down his briefcase and started toward the staircase, thinking Sienna might be upstairs, but then he heard something that made him freeze. A voice, strained and pleading, coming from the direction of the hallway that led to the back terrace where his mother's cottage was visible. He moved quickly, but quietly, toward the sound, his business instincts telling him something was wrong. As he approached the French doors leading to the terrace, he could hear Sienna's voice, sharp and vicious, saying something he couldn't quite make out. Then he heard his mother's voice, trembling and frightened, words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Please, please don't hurt me anymore." Julian reached the doorway just in time to see Sienna grab his mother by the wrist and twist it viciously, forcing Rosemary to her knees. His mother's face was contorted with pain and fear, tears streaming down her cheeks as she begged Sienna to stop. The scene before him was so shocking, so completely at odds with everything he thought he knew, that for several seconds he couldn't process what he was witnessing. Sienna had Rosemary on the terrace stones, her designer heel pressing down on the hem of Rosemary's skirt to keep her from rising. Her hand still gripping Rosemary's wrist at an unnatural angle. Rosemary's reading glasses had fallen and cracked on the stone, and she was struggling to maintain her balance while pleading in a broken voice. Julian had never heard from his strong, dignified mother. The shock lasted only moments before it transformed into something primal. A rage, so absolute and pure, that Julian felt it surge through every nerve in his body. He had always considered himself a controlled man, someone who solved problems through logic and negotiation. But in that instant, seeing the woman he had planned to marry tormenting his mother, he understood how people could lose all restraint. This woman he had loved, had trusted, had welcomed into his family, was actively hurting the person who had sacrificed everything for him. Julian's voice, when he finally found it, was deadly quiet. He said Sienna's name once. Just once. But the tone carried enough weight to make her spin around in shock, immediately releasing Rosemary's wrist. Her expression flickered rapidly through surprise, fear, and then calculation as her mind raced to construct an explanation that might save her. But there was no explanation that could erase what Julian had seen with his own eyes. Rosemary collapsed onto the terrace, her body shaking with sobs of relief mixed with shame. Julian moved past Sienna without a word, going straight to his mother and gently helping her sit up. His hands were steady as he retrieved her broken glasses and checked her for injuries. But inside he was trembling with fury unlike anything he had ever experienced. Rosemary tried to speak, tried to explain or perhaps apologize, but Julian quietly told her it was okay, that she didn't need to say anything right now. He noticed the finger marks on her wrist already darkening to bruises, the way she cradled her arm protectively, the absolute terror in her eyes that was only now beginning to fade. He helped her to a terrace chair and made sure she was stable before he finally turned to face Sienna. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he had imagined spending his life with, suddenly looked like a complete stranger, and not a pleasant one. Her carefully constructed beauty seemed hollow now, attractive mask hiding something ugly and cruel underneath. Sienna had recovered some of her composure and was already launching into her defense. She claimed that Rosemary had been confused and agitated, that she had been trying to help her inside when the old woman had become difficult and combative. She insisted that Julian had misunderstood what he saw, that his mother sometimes got disoriented and aggressive, that Sienna had only been trying to calm her down and prevent her from hurting herself. The lies flowed smoothly, practiced, as if she had rehearsed this moment. But Julian had heard his mother's words. He had seen the terror in her eyes. He had witnessed the deliberate cruelty in Sienna's grip, and the calculated pressure of her heel on Rosemary's skirt. He looked at his mother, really looked at her for the first time in months, and suddenly saw all the signs he had been too busy and too trusting to notice. The weight loss, the way she flinched at sudden movements, the haunted expression she wore when she thought no one was watching, the excuses for bruises he had accepted so easily. How had he missed it? How had he been so blind? Julian told Sienna to stop talking. His voice remained calm, but it carried an authority that made clear this was not a request. He asked his mother directly if this had happened before, if Sienna had hurt her before this moment. Rosemary hesitated, her lifelong instinct to protect her son warring with her desperate need to finally tell the truth. But the relief of not having to hide anymore won out, and she nodded, tears flowing freely down her face as months of suppressed pain came flooding out. The admission shattered something fundamental in Julian. He had prided himself on being a good son, on providing for his mother after all she had done for him, on creating a home where she could live in comfort and peace, and all this time, under his own roof, she had been suffering while he remained blissfully unaware, too focused on his career and his relationship to see the truth. The guilt was crushing, paired with a determination that nothing like this would ever happen again. He asked Rosemary how long it had been going on. Her voice barely audible, she admitted it had started not long after the engagement, that it had gotten progressively worse. She apologized, actually apologized for not telling him sooner, saying she hadn't wanted to ruin his happiness. Julian felt his heart break at her words. His mother had endured abuse to protect his feelings, and he had been too wrapped up in his own life to notice. Sienna's strategy shifted when she realized her lies weren't working. She became defensive, then accusatory. She claimed that Rosemary had been manipulative from the start, that she had never accepted Sienna, that the old woman had been passively hostile and undermining their relationship. She painted herself as the victim, subjected to Rosemary's cold treatment and judgment, finally pushed to her limit. Sienna suggested that maybe Julian should consider whether his mother's confusion was actually calculated to come between them. But Julian wasn't listening anymore. He had seen the evidence with his own eyes, and more importantly, he knew his mother. Rosemary had never been manipulative or cruel in her entire life. She had welcomed Sienna into their family with open arms, had tried repeatedly to build a relationship with the woman her son loved, had expressed nothing but happiness about the engagement. Every accusation Sienna made only served to reveal more of her true character: selfish, cruel, and willing to hurt a defenseless elderly woman to get what she wanted. Julian made his decision in that moment, a decision that was both painful and absolutely necessary. He told Sienna to go inside, pack her belongings, and leave his property immediately. The engagement was over, effective that instant. She was no longer welcome in his home or his life. The wedding was cancelled. She had 1 hour to collect her things before he would call security to escort her out. Sienna's face transformed into something ugly as the reality sank in. The mask of the sophisticated loving fiancé was completely gone. Replaced by rage and desperation, she threatened him. Said he would regret this. That she would sue him for breach of promise. That she would destroy his reputation in their social circles. She claimed she had given up prime years for him. That she deserved compensation for the time she had invested in their relationship. The money and status she had pretended not to care about suddenly became the focus of every word she spoke. Julian remained unmoved. He told her coldly that she had exactly 1 hour, and that his attorneys would be in touch regarding the return of the engagement ring. A flawless 4-carat diamond that had cost him $200,000, and any other items that belonged to him. He also made it clear that if she ever attempted to contact him or his mother again, he would pursue legal action for assault and harassment, and he had more than enough resources and connections to make sure she never worked in Chicago's social scene again. Sienna realized she had lost. Her threats held no power here, not against a man with Julian's resources, determination, and ironclad reputation. She stormed inside, her stilettos clicking angrily on the terrace stones. Julian could hear her moving around upstairs, slamming drawers and cursing loudly enough for him to hear. He didn't care. His only concern was the fragile woman sitting before him, the mother who had sacrificed so much and deserved so much better than what he had unknowingly allowed to happen. He pulled another terrace chair close to his mother and sat down, taking her weathered hands in his. He apologized, his voice thick with emotion he rarely showed. He told her he was sorry for being blind, for not protecting her, for allowing that woman into their lives. Rosemary tried to reassure him, to tell him it wasn't his fault, but Julian wouldn't accept her forgiveness so easily. He had failed in his most basic duty as a son, and he would have to live with that knowledge. They sat together in silence for a while, Julian holding his mother's hands as she gradually stopped crying. Inside, they could hear Sienna loading her things, the sounds of her departure harsh and angry. When the noise finally stopped and they heard her Range Rover roar down the driveway with unnecessary aggression, both of them felt a weight lift, as if the estate itself was breathing easier without her toxic presence polluting it. Julian helped his mother walk back to her cottage, made sure she was comfortable on her favorite reading chair, and made her chamomile tea the way she had made it for him countless times when he was a child. They talked late into the night, Rosemary finally sharing all the details she had kept hidden: every cruel word, every painful incident, every moment of fear she had endured. Julian listened, his heart breaking with each revelation, his resolve strengthening to somehow make this right. In the following days, Julian cancelled all the wedding arrangements. The deposits were lost. The explanations were awkward, but he didn't care about any of it. He told close friends and business associates the truth: that he had discovered Sienna was not who he thought she was, and that protecting his mother was his only priority. Most people understood. Some gossiped. Julian ignored them all, focusing entirely on Rosemary's recovery. He arranged for a doctor to examine his mother, documenting her injuries for potential legal action if Sienna ever tried to retaliate with false claims. The doctor confirmed bruising consistent with forceful gripping and twisting, older injuries in various stages of healing, and recommended counseling to help Rosemary process the trauma she had experienced. Julian found the best therapist in Chicago and made sure his mother had regular appointments scheduled. But more than medical care, Rosemary needed time to heal emotionally. The trust she had placed in her son's judgment had been shaken, and though she never blamed Julian, he could see the lingering fear in her eyes. She startled at sudden noises, hesitated before speaking up about her needs, and often seemed to be bracing herself for criticism that no longer came. It broke Julian's heart to see what Sienna's cruelty had done to his mother's gentle spirit. Julian made significant changes in his life. He cut back dramatically on travel, delegated more responsibilities to his executives, and spent far more time at the estate. He made sure Rosemary knew she was safe, that she would never have to fear mistreatment in her own home again. They took long walks around the property together, cooked meals side by side in the cottage kitchen, and slowly rebuilt the comfortable relationship that Sienna had nearly destroyed. Weeks passed, then months. The gossip about the canceled wedding faded as new scandals captured Chicago society's attention. Sienna had disappeared from their social circles, apparently having moved to Los Angeles in search of new opportunities. Julian heard, through mutual acquaintances, that she had already attached herself to another wealthy man, a tech entrepreneur with more money than sense. He felt sorry for the man but didn't warn him that lesson wasn't his to teach. But something had changed in Julian beyond just being more present for his mother. The experience had opened his eyes to his own privilege and blindness. He had been so focused on building wealth and professional reputation that he had forgotten what truly mattered. His mother, who had lived modestly and loved unconditionally, was worth more than all his business deals combined. And there were countless other elderly people in the world who were vulnerable, who had no one to protect them from abuse and neglect. Julian began researching elder abuse, shocked by the statistics and stories he discovered. It was far more common than he had imagined, often hidden behind closed doors, just as it had been in his own home. The elderly were dismissed, their complaints ignored, their experiences invalidated. They became invisible to a society that valued youth and productivity above wisdom and experience. An idea began forming in Julian's mind, one that grew stronger each day. He had resources, connections, and now he had a purpose. He would create something meaningful, something that would help vulnerable seniors and honor the woman who had raised him. It would be his way of turning the pain and guilt into something positive, something that could make a real difference. He spent weeks developing the concept, consulting with social workers, attorneys, and advocacy groups. He researched best practices in elder care and protection. He assembled a team of dedicated professionals who shared his vision. And finally, 6 months after the incident that had shattered his illusions, Julian launched the Rosemary Caldwell Foundation for Elder Dignity and Protection. The foundation offered multiple services: legal advocacy for seniors facing abuse, financial assistance for those struggling to afford quality care, educational programs to train caregivers, and a 24-hour hotline where elderly individuals could report mistreatment and receive immediate help. Julian funded it generously from his personal fortune, ensuring that money would never be an obstacle to helping those in need. He named it after his mother, both to honor her and to ensure that her suffering would have meaning beyond their personal experience. Rosemary was deeply moved by her son's gesture. She insisted on being involved, despite Julian's concerns about her reliving traumatic experiences. But Rosemary was stronger than she looked, and she understood that her story could help others find their voice. She began volunteering at the foundation, speaking at senior centers and community facilities about the warning signs of abuse and the importance of speaking up. Her gentle presence and obvious sincerity made her an effective advocate, and many elderly people found the courage to seek help after hearing her speak. The foundation grew rapidly, its mission resonating with communities across Illinois and eventually across the Midwest. Julian found himself deeply involved in the day-to-day operations, discovering a sense of purpose that his business ventures had never provided. Making money was easy, changing lives was meaningful. He had spent years accumulating wealth, and now he was learning how to use it in ways that actually mattered. It was at a foundation fundraiser, about a year after Sienna's departure, that Julian met Nina Foster. She was volunteering at the event, helping coordinate transportation for elderly attendees and ensuring that everyone had assistance if needed. Julian noticed her immediately, not just because she was attractive, though she certainly was, with warm brown eyes, natural curls she wore in a casual ponytail, and an easy smile that reached her eyes, but because of the genuine care she showed to every person she interacted with. Nina was 36, a social worker who specialized in elder advocacy, and had been volunteering with the foundation since its inception. She had been drawn to the mission because of her own grandmother who had suffered financial abuse from a caregiver. When Julian introduced himself, she didn't fawn over his wealth or status. Instead, she engaged him in a thoughtful conversation about how the foundation could better reach isolated seniors in rural communities. She challenged some of his assumptions, suggested innovative approaches based on her field experience, and made it clear that she cared about results, not recognition or proximity to power. Julian found himself drawn to Nina in a way he hadn't expected to feel again. But this time, he was careful. He paid attention to how she treated others, especially those who couldn't offer her anything in return. He watched how she interacted with Rosemary, when she thought no one was looking, noting the genuine warmth and respect in every exchange, the way she actually listened to the older woman's stories rather than just waiting for her turn to talk. He took his time, building a friendship before considering anything more, learning from his mistakes. Rosemary noticed, of course. Mothers always do. She saw how Julian's eyes followed Nina around the room, how he smiled more easily when Nina was near, how he found excuses to work on foundation projects that Nina was involved with. But more importantly, Rosemary saw who Nina really was, a woman with a good heart, someone who had dedicated her career to helping vulnerable people, who volunteered her limited free time, because she genuinely cared about making a difference, not about being seen making a difference. Rosemary kept her observations to herself, not wanting to pressure her son, but she felt hopeful in a way she hadn't since before Sienna had entered their lives. Months passed, and Julian and Nina's friendship deepened naturally, organically. They worked together on foundation projects, grabbing coffee to discuss strategies and staying late to review grant applications. They discovered shared interests beyond their work, a love of hiking in the dunes along Lake Michigan, an appreciation for old jazz records, a tendency to rescue stray animals that showed up at the most inconvenient times. Julian told Nina about Sienna, about what had happened and what he had learned about himself. Nina listened without judgment, sharing her own story of a failed engagement to someone who had seemed perfect on paper but had turned out to be emotionally unavailable and subtly controlling. Their first real date happened almost by accident. They had been working late at the foundation office, reviewing applications for a new program, providing home safety modifications for seniors. When they finally looked up, they realized it was past 9 o'clock, and neither had eaten dinner. Julian suggested they grab something at a nearby diner, nothing fancy, just food and conversation to decompress. That simple meal stretched into 4 hours of talking and laughing, the kind of easy comfort that can't be forced or faked, the kind that comes from genuine connection rather than performative chemistry. Unlike with Sienna, there was no rush, no pressure, no performance. Nina never asked about Julian's net worth or properties. She never suggested expensive restaurants or designer shopping trips to be photographed at. She was content with simple pleasures, walks in the forest preserves, movie nights at home with takeout, volunteering together at the foundation on weekends. She treated Rosemary not as an obligation to be tolerated, but as a person to be valued, someone whose stories and wisdom were worth hearing, whose company was a gift rather than a burden. Rosemary watched her son fall in love again, and this time she felt only happiness, no reservations or concerns. She got to know Nina during casual dinners at the cottage, afternoon tea in the garden, and foundation events where they worked side by side. Nina asked Rosemary about her life, her experiences raising Julian alone, the challenges she had overcome, the poetry she loved. She listened with genuine interest, never dismissive or condescending. And when Rosemary occasionally struggled with moments of anxiety or fear, residual effects from her ordeal with Sienna, Nina was patient and understanding, never pushing but always supportive, gently suggesting coping strategies from her professional training, without ever making Rosemary feel broken or weak. One Sunday afternoon, about 18 months after Sienna had been expelled from their lives, Julian found his mother in her garden, tending to her roses. He sat beside her on the weathered bench his father had built decades ago, watching her work with practiced ease. After a comfortable silence, Julian told Rosemary that he was thinking about asking Nina to marry him. He wanted to know how his mother felt about it, if she had any concerns or reservations, if she truly believed Nina was different from Sienna. Rosemary set down her pruning shears and looked at her son with those wise hazel eyes that had seen so much. She told him that Nina was nothing like Sienna, that she could see the difference as clearly as day and night. Sienna had been all surface beauty and charm, hiding cruelty and selfishness underneath a carefully constructed facade. Nina's beauty came from within, from a genuine goodness that couldn't be faked or performed. She made Julian happy, not through expensive gifts or exotic trips, but through simple presence and authentic connection. She valued what mattered: kindness, integrity, service to others, rather than what could be purchased or displayed. Rosemary gave her blessing without hesitation, tears of joy in her eyes, telling Julian that she saw in Nina the daughter she had always hoped for. Julian proposed to Nina on a quiet evening in the foundation office, surrounded by files and photos of the lives they had helped change together. There was no yacht, no audience, no grand gesture designed to impress or create a social media moment. Just two people who had found something real in each other, built on shared values and genuine affection, on mutual respect and common purpose. Nina said yes without hesitation, laughing and crying at the same time, and they celebrated with Rosemary over homemade lasagna in the cottage's cozy kitchen. Just the three of them, which felt absolutely perfect. The wedding, when it finally took place, was nothing like the extravaganza Julian had planned with Sienna. It was a small ceremony in the garden that Rosemary loved, with only close friends and foundation colleagues in attendance. Rosemary stood beside Julian as he married Nina, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. She had her son back, truly back, not distracted or deceived but present and genuine. And she had gained a daughter-in-law who treated her with kindness and respect, who valued her presence rather than resenting it, who understood that family was about love and loyalty, rather than obligation or appearance. The foundation continued to grow, touching thousands of lives across the Midwest. Julian and Nina worked together, their partnership extending from their marriage into their shared mission. Rosemary remained involved as long as her health permitted, her testimony and presence a powerful reminder of why the work mattered. The estate that had once housed cruelty and deception became a home filled with love and purpose, a place where vulnerable people could find help and hope. Julian never forgot the lesson he had learned that terrible afternoon when he had witnessed Sienna's true nature. He remained vigilant, not just in protecting his mother, but in being aware of injustice and suffering wherever he encountered it. His wealth and success, which had once been ends in themselves, became tools for creating positive change. And every time he saw elderly individuals finding safety and dignity through the foundation's work, he thought of his mother's courage in finally speaking up, even though it had taken far too long for him to truly listen and see what was happening right in front of him. Years passed, bringing the inevitable changes that time delivers. Rosemary's health gradually declined, as it does for all who live long lives. But she spent her final years surrounded by love, in a home where she was cherished and valued, secure in the knowledge that her son had found genuine happiness with a woman who truly deserved him. When she passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 83, she left behind a legacy of grace and resilience that continued to inspire the foundation bearing her name. Julian grieved deeply but found comfort in the work they had built together. The Rosemary Caldwell Foundation expanded its reach, opening regional offices and helping to pass legislation protecting elder rights. Nina stood beside Julian through his grief, offering the same patient support that defined everything she did, never trying to rush his healing, understanding that grief has its own timeline. Together, they ensured that Rosemary's suffering had meaning, that her story helped prevent others from experiencing similar pain. On the 10th anniversary of the Foundation's founding, Julian stood before a crowded ballroom full of donors, advocates, and elderly individuals whose lives had been changed by the organization's work. He spoke about his mother, about the day that had shattered his illusions and opened his eyes to what truly mattered. He talked about how easy it is to become blind to suffering when it doesn't directly affect you, how privilege can insulate people from uncomfortable truths, how busy schedules and professional success can become excuses for not seeing what's right in front of you. But mostly Julian spoke about love, the kind of love that endures sacrifice, that protects the vulnerable, that chooses what's right over what's easy or convenient. His mother had loved him that way, working multiple jobs to exhaustion to give him opportunities she never had. And when he had failed to protect her, when he had chosen his own happiness over her safety, without even realizing it, she had still loved him enough to help him build something meaningful from the ashes of his mistakes, to turn his guilt into purpose rather than letting it consume him. The crowd gave Julian a standing ovation, but he deflected the praise. This wasn't about him or his redemption. It was about the thousands of elderly individuals who deserved to live their final years with dignity and safety, who had earned respect through their decades of contribution to the world. It was about changing a culture that dismissed and devalued its oldest members, that allowed abuse to flourish in shadows because people found it uncomfortable to acknowledge or address. As Julian looked out at the audience, he saw faces young and old, wealthy and struggling, all united in the belief that every person, regardless of age, deserved to be treated with kindness and respect. He saw Nina standing to the side, her eyes shining with pride and love, their two adopted children beside her, teenagers now, who had grown up understanding the value of service and compassion. And in his heart, he felt his mother's presence, the gentle spirit that had shaped him into the man he had become. The foundation that had started from personal tragedy had become a force for systemic good, preventing countless others from experiencing what Rosemary had endured. And while Julian would have given anything to go back and protect his mother from the beginning, to have seen through Sienna's deception before damage was done, he had learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building a better future, one choice at a time, one life protected at a time, one system changed at a time. Julian Caldwell had learned the hard way that the people we love most deserve our attention and protection, not just our money and good intentions. He had discovered that true character reveals itself in how people treat those who are vulnerable, those who cannot fight back or offer anything in return. And he had found that genuine happiness comes not from beautiful facades and social status, but from authentic connections with people of integrity and compassion, from work that matters and love that's real. The estate in Lake Forest still stood, its rooms filled with light and warmth and the sounds of a real family, not a performed one. The garden Rosemary had loved continued to bloom each spring, tended now by Nina with the same care Rosemary had shown, teaching their children the names of flowers and the patience required to nurture living things. And somewhere in that house, in frames scattered throughout the rooms, were photographs that told the real story, not of wealth and success, but of a mother's love, a son's awakening, and the family they had built on foundations far stronger than money or status could ever provide. The scars from that terrible time never fully disappeared, but they had transformed into something more valuable than smooth, unmarked skin. They became reminders of important truths, guides for making better choices, and the foundation upon which real meaning was built. Julian had started his adult life chasing conventional success, wealth, status, the perfect partner. He had achieved it all, and nearly lost everything that mattered in the process. But in the end he had found something more valuable than any business deal or luxury estate. He had found purpose, genuine love, and the knowledge that protecting the vulnerable was the highest calling a person of privilege could answer. The foundation continued its work year after year, touching lives and changing systems, expanding its reach, while never losing sight of the individual people it served. They developed new programs, to address financial abuse of seniors, created technology solutions to help isolated elderly people stay connected and safe, trained thousands of caregivers in recognizing and preventing abuse, and worked with lawmakers to strengthen protections and increase penalties for those who harmed vulnerable adults. Julian had become a national voice on elder rights, testifying before Congress, appearing on news programs, writing op-eds that reached millions, but he never forgot that his authority to speak on this issue came not from his business success or his wealth, but from his failure to see, to act, to protect his own mother when she needed him most. He spoke with humility about his blindness, his mistakes, his wake-up call, and that vulnerability gave his words power that polished speeches never could have achieved. Nina had proven to be not just the perfect life partner, but also the ideal co-leader for the foundation. Her social work expertise complemented Julian's business acumen, and together they had created something truly transformational. She never let the foundation's success go to her head, always staying grounded in the actual work of helping actual people. Remembering that behind every statistic was a human being with a story, with dignity, with value. On quiet evenings, when the house was peaceful, and their children were asleep, Julian and Nina would sometimes sit in Rosemary's garden, surrounded by the roses that kept blooming year after year. They would talk about the foundation's work, about the lives they had touched that day, about the challenges still ahead, but they also talked about simple things: the kids' upcoming school events, the vegetables they wanted to plant, the vacation they were planning to national parks out west. Julian had found the balance that had once seemed impossible: meaningful success, combined with genuine personal happiness, professional achievement, intertwined with authentic human connection. He didn't have to choose between building wealth and creating social impact. He could use one to accomplish the other. He didn't have to sacrifice love for ambition. He could have both when they were rooted in genuine values and mutual respect. Sometimes Julian thought about Sienna, wondered what had become of her, whether she had ever reflected on her actions or felt remorse. Probably not, he thought. People like her rarely did, but that wasn't his concern. His concern was ensuring that no other elderly person suffered as his mother had suffered, that no other son or daughter was blind to abuse happening right in front of them, that society's most vulnerable members had champions willing to fight for them. The foundation had implemented innovative programs that became models studied by organizations around the world. They had created a matching system that paired elderly abuse survivors with trained peer counselors who had been through similar experiences. They had developed curriculum for medical schools and nursing programs to help healthcare providers recognize and respond to elder abuse. They had established partnerships with banks and financial institutions to detect and prevent financial exploitation. They had worked with technology companies to create discreet reporting tools that elderly people could use even when their abusers were nearby. Each initiative was designed with the understanding that speaking up was difficult, especially when the abuser was family, especially when victims felt ashamed or feared they wouldn't be believed. Julian had learned from his mother's silence that creating safe channels for reporting wasn't enough. They had to build a culture where elderly people knew they would be believed, supported, and protected. Years continued to pass, and Julian's hairline receded, while Nina's natural curls gained streaks of silver. Their children grew into young adults with a deep commitment to social justice, inspired by their parents' work and their grandmother Rosemary's story. The foundation celebrated its 20th anniversary with a gala that raised $10 million in a single night, every penny going directly to programs and services. But the most meaningful moment of that anniversary celebration wasn't the fundraising totals or the celebrity appearances or the media coverage. It was when an elderly man named George stood up during the testimonials and shared his story. He had been physically abused by his son for 3 years, too ashamed to tell anyone, convinced that somehow he had failed as a father and deserved the treatment. Then he had heard Rosemary speak at his senior center 5 years earlier, had heard her story, had realized he wasn't alone. He had called the foundation's hotline, and they had helped him escape the situation and rebuild his life. Now he volunteered with the foundation, helping other men find the courage to speak up, because elder abuse of men by their children was especially underreported due to shame and societal expectation. Julian listened to George's testimony with tears streaming down his face, thinking about how his mother's willingness to share her painful story had quite literally saved this man's life. Rosemary had been so embarrassed, so worried about being judged, but she had found the courage to speak publicly anyway, because she understood that her story had power to help others. That courage had rippled outward in ways none of them could have fully predicted. The foundation expanded internationally, bringing their model to Canada, the UK, Australia, and eventually to developing nations where elder care systems were even less developed. Julian and Nina traveled extensively, learning from advocates around the world, adapting their programs to different cultural contexts, building a global network of organizations committed to elder dignity and protection. But no matter how far they traveled or how large the foundation grew, Julian always returned to his mother's garden in Lake Forest, to the place where Rosemary had found peace, to the roses that bloomed in cycles of death and renewal, a perfect metaphor for the work they were doing, taking pain and loss and transforming it into new life, new hope, new possibilities. As Julian entered his 60s, he began planning for succession, identifying and mentoring younger leaders who could carry the foundation forward. When he and Nina eventually stepped back, he wanted to ensure that the foundation would outlive him, that the work would continue for generations, that his mother's legacy would extend far into a future she would never see, but had helped create. He established an endowment that would fund the foundation in perpetuity, ensuring financial stability regardless of economic conditions or changing donor priorities. He created a governance structure that would keep the organization true to its mission even as leadership changed. But most importantly, he worked to ensure that the spirit of the foundation, the commitment to listening to elderly people themselves, to believing them, to treating them with dignity, was deeply embedded in the organizational culture. Julian told Rosemary's story over and over, not just the facts but the lessons, making sure that future generations of foundation staff understood why they had been founded, who they served, and what values guided their work. He brought in elderly people to serve on the board of directors, to lead staff trainings, to review programs, ensuring that those most affected by the foundation's work had real power in shaping it. On the 25th anniversary, the foundation announced that it had helped its millionth elderly person, a milestone that brought both celebration and sadness. Celebration for the impact achieved, sadness that there had been 1 million people who needed help in the first place. The event featured a video tribute to Rosemary, archival footage of her speaking about her experience, photos of her volunteering at the foundation, testimonials from people she had personally helped. Julian watched the tribute with Nina's hand in his, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, by foundation staff and volunteers, by elderly survivors who had found safety and dignity. He thought about how his life had pivoted on that single moment of coming home early, of finally seeing the truth he had been blind to for so long. That moment of horror had become a catalyst for transformation, personal, organizational, and eventually societal. He thought about Sienna sometimes, not with anger but with a strange kind of gratitude. Her cruelty had been the wake-up call he apparently needed, the shock that had opened his eyes to what truly mattered. Without that terrible moment, he might have continued on his path of accumulating wealth and status, measuring success by Forbes rankings and square footage, never discovering the deeper purpose that had given his life real meaning. But he was also grateful for Nina, who had shown him what real love looked like, love based on shared values and genuine respect. Love that included his mother rather than resenting her. Love that made him a better person rather than requiring him to ignore his conscience. And he was grateful for the years he had been able to spend with his mother after rescuing her. Years when he had truly been present, when he had listened to her stories and learned from her wisdom, when he had told her every day that he loved her and she was safe. As Julian stood to speak at the 25th anniversary, he looked out at a room full of people whose lives intersected with his mother's legacy. He spoke about second chances, about how it's never too late to open your eyes and change course, about how the worst moments of our lives can become the foundation for our most meaningful work if we have the courage to learn from them rather than hide from them. My mother taught me 2 crucial lessons, Julian said, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. First, through her years of sacrifice and love, she taught me that real strength looks like quiet perseverance, that heroism isn't always dramatic or recognized, that the most important work often happens in the background, with no applause or acknowledgement. And second, through her suffering and her courage to finally speak up, she taught me that we all have a responsibility to see what's in front of us, act when we witness injustice, to use whatever privilege and power we have to protect those who are vulnerable. He paused, looking at the photo of Rosemary projected on the screen behind him. A candid shot of her in her garden, smiling gently at something off camera surrounded by roses in full bloom. She would be embarrassed by all this attention, Julian continued. She was the most humble person I've ever known. But she would also be proud, not of me, but of every person in this room and beyond, who has dedicated themselves to protecting elderly people, who has believed a survivor when they found the courage to speak up, who has intervened when they witnessed abuse, who has changed a system or passed a law or simply been present for someone who needed them. The audience rose in another standing ovation. But Julian knew his mother would have wanted the applause directed not at her memory, but at the work itself, at the ongoing commitment to dignity and justice that continued every day in communities around the world. That was her real legacy, not a foundation bearing her name, but a movement she had helped spark, a shift in how society viewed and treated its eldest members. As the evening concluded and guests began to leave, Julian walked out to the terrace where he could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Nina joined him, slipping her hand into his without speaking. They stood in comfortable silence, partners in life and work and purpose, 2 people who had found each other through circumstances neither would have chosen but both had learned from. Julian thought about the journey that had brought him here, the success and blindness, the betrayal and awakening, the guilt and redemption, the grief and purpose. He thought about how different his life had turned out from what he had planned, how much richer and more meaningful it was than the shallow existence he had been living when Sienna was in his life. Most of all, he thought about his mother, her gentle strength, her quiet wisdom, her capacity for love and forgiveness. She had given him life twice, once when she raised him against all odds, and again when her suffering had awakened him to what really mattered. He had spent the last 25 years trying to honor that gift, trying to make sure her pain had purpose, trying to protect others the way he had failed to protect her quickly enough. The work would continue after he was gone. The foundation would outlive him, carrying forward the mission into a future he wouldn't see. But he had done what he could with the time and resources given to him. He had turned his privilege into protection for the vulnerable, his guilt into action for justice, his personal tragedy into systemic change. Julian Caldwell had learned that success isn't measured in net worth or buildings bearing your name. It's measured in lives touched, in suffering prevented, in dignity restored, in the legacy of love and service you leave behind. And by that measure, thanks to his mother's courage and sacrifice, he had succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined in those early days when success meant only money and status, and the admiration of people who didn't really matter. The Rosemary Caldwell Foundation would continue its work for generations to come, a living monument to a woman who had endured suffering in silence until she finally found her voice, and to a son who had failed and learned and dedicated his life to making sure that no other family would have to experience what they had endured. That was the real meaning of legacy, not what you build for yourself but what you create for others, not what you achieve but what you protect, not what you accumulate but what you give away. Every story carries within it an echo of our shared humanity. If this story has touched your heart, share it with someone special, leave us a comment about what you felt, and subscribe to join us for more soul-reaching stories. Because every life tells a story that deserves to be heard. See you next time.